and welcome to the Carping Gnome. This is part 1 of a 3-part series on the subject of wild carp. And today I'm just going to talk about what exactly a wild carp is by nature of its history. First of all, it's pretty good to say what a wild carp is not. King carp, mirrors, commons, leathers and so forth, were not common in Britain until the late 19th century, when Thomas Ford of Caister in Lincolnshire was actually importing these faster growing, larger fish. Before then there were carp in England, but they were not what we call king carp. But when did they come? They're not native to Britain. Isaac Walton, in the middle of the 17th century, talked about a contemporary or near contemporary, Sir Roger Bacon, who's famous for the rhyme, hops and turkey, carps and beer came into England all in a year. And Sir Roger Bacon apparently said that there were no carp in England around 100 years ago. Now that's around Walton's time, so he's saying in his chronicles that there were no carp in England before, say, between 1520 and 1550. We know that's not true. In Treatises of Fishing with an Angle by Dame Juliana Berners, well, most people don't think she wrote it now, but she's always been cited as the author. She said that the Duke of Norfolk stocked carp into his ponds in 1463, if I remember correctly. So that's pushing it back a little bit further. And research by Chris Curry, the late carp historian and angler Chris Curry, seemed to intimate that carp were here as early as 1350, possibly earlier. I've actually had a brief scan through historical records, archaeological digs. Nothing heavy, nothing deep. I can't find evidence of carp bones being found in digs prior to about 1350. And when you're talking about the Romans, who some people think may have brought carp to Britain, there was a mummified carp apparently found in the ruins of Silchester Manor in the late Victorian times, a mummified carp. And if that's so, it shows that at least a mummified carp was in Britain maybe 1,600 years ago. But as John Langridge pointed out in Aphrodite's Carp, the carp was probably sacred to Aphrodite, so it could have been a ritualistic fish brought in specially for some purpose. We don't know. I think it's very likely then that there were no carp in England before about 1350, and maybe the famous stories about monks and so forth stocking them for food so they'd have fish on Fridays, maybe there's some truth in that, and the evidence of a few ponds still containing carp from the medieval period near priories seems to support that. It's a puzzle. And then we ask, what's a wildie? Kevin Clifford famously said that there's no such thing in Britain, a wild carp. There's no such thing. Wild carp are native to the Danube area, perhaps parts of Asia too, and they're river fish. He was saying, well, by the time you brought carp over here, they are domesticated, and so that they're not wild carp. We've never had wild carp in Britain. I think that's probably pushing it a little bit too far. Mark Walsinger, in A Fool and His Eel, said that, well, yes, it seems to imply that all our wildies are thin, feral commons, feral kings, but they're not. They're absolutely not. Going back to Thomas Ford of Caister again, 1880, 1890, when he was importing kings, we know there were quite large carp in British waters before then, in Cheshunt Reservoir and at Croxby and places like that, and some of them were quite deep fish, but they were not. You can't really call them king carp. What were they? Personally, my view is that we're probably on safer ground if we talk about heritage commons. I like that phrase because it implies a pre-king origin. It acknowledges that there is a strong history behind strains of carp still in this country before the kings were introduced. Heritage commons. We're not saying they're wild carp, such as you might have once found in the Danube and its tributaries. We are saying, though, that they are ancient strains, and I think wild is as good a name as any, to be honest. So that's the challenge for anyone, I think, seeking old strains of carp heritage commons, to find out waters where they might still exist. And in the next section I shall talk about waters where I think I found heritage commons and where heritage commons are certainly still believed to exist, and my thoughts and my experiences of fishing for them. Finally, before we go, I like to demonstrate what it's like for a gnome to plead and beg. Please subscribe. We really appreciate the folks who've already done so, but by subscribing you support us and you give us the encouragement to carry on, and we want to do a good job for you all and to build our community. Please subscribe. Thank you.